All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AM 731-2019, Design Services for Port Modernization Program, Petroleum Cement Terminal. Let's go ahead and start with introductions on this side.
Suzanne LeBron.
Felix Rivera.
Bill Falsey, the Anchorage Municipal Manager.
Jeff Poole, Jacobs Engineering.
And I believe we have someone on the phone.
Crystal Kennedy online.
And do we have anyone else on the phone? Okay. So we have a pretty big contract before us. Chris, why don't you go ahead and lay the framework here, and then we'll get started.
Thank you. So this extension and increase of funding amendment to the purchase order for Cowie is to move forward to the next steps of the port modernization. And there were a number of questions from members at the last meeting, so it was pulled from the consent agenda and asked for a briefing on this before it is awarded or not. There were a number of issues or items inside that it was paying for that there were questions about. And with that, we'd just like a briefing on this proposal.
Thank you. Mr. Palsy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs. We'll punch the lights. Jeff Poole is going to give the main presentation. I'm going to steal his thunder and give you the 30-second version. The change order in the main really divides into three categories. One is the expected change order that will come every time we continue construction, and that Chloe, the designer of record, performs services only when we know what we're building and we're actually building things. So there'll be a change order this time for the 2020 scope of work, and there'll be a future change order for the 2021 scope of work. That's built in. We don't give them all the money before we're really moving forward. Two, we're designing some new things that we have pulled back to Chloe's lap rather than allow to be in the bid packages in the future. And three, we've got some value engineering items that are coming out of that conversation, along with a rounding error of number 4, which is just miscellaneous cleanup from previous change orders. So with that light introduction, I'm going to ride sidecar and let Jeff Poole take the helm.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So I put together a couple of slides, and they follow the recommendation of award format there. There's a number of categories, and so I've got a slide for each one of these categories. I'm going to walk down through the breakdown. First, I just wanted to mention I've got a few questions about lump sum versus time and expense not to exceed, or T&E or NTE type work. The lump sum work, we have COE do anything that they can forward price, they can quantify and estimate the level of effort we do under a lump sum format, and that makes them responsible for cost management and control of their resources. Things that they're reactive to, request for information during construction or reviewing construction submittals, supporting permitting application questions and things like that, they do on a T&E or NTE basis. So that's the two categories of cost in their contract and how we try to structure for the most part the work. The first section of the recommendation to award is some credits. These are 3 line items here that were originally contemplated as lump sum work. Now, normally in lump sum work, if COE exceeds the lump sum amount internally with their cost, they have to eat the overrun, and if they underrun that lump sum, they get to enjoy the savings that underrun. There were a couple items where the work actually in the field or during the design process, we didn't have to do as much as we thought we would have to do under the lump sum work, and COE has offered up credits on some of those lump sum items, and partial credits. So we've captured reductions in some of the lump sum items for the existing contract. That came to $56,000 of credits. The next section is support for the 2020 construction work, a term that we commonly use as services during construction. This has actually got a little bit of lump sum work. Most of it's reimbursable or NTE. There's $6,000 for management meetings, for bi-weekly management meetings throughout the construction season. We do that on a lump sum. It's because it's more advantageous to us that we don't have to get into if we ask for an extra meeting, that we have to pay them more and things like that. So we kind of estimate how many meetings, and we just leave it at that. And past experience has worked out to our favor, so we do that under lump sum. The other two categories is just management and reporting, and then services during construction, which is, like I said, the RFIs, construction submittals. There are some field inspections that we ask the designer director to do to verify that the construction contractor is meeting the intent of the design. And that comes out to $458,000. So the total under this category, like I said, is $6,000 lump sum and $570,000 budget for T&E type work. And to Bill's point, next year you'll see another change order with this same type of setup for 2021 services during construction once we know exactly what's going to get constructed in 2021.
And to first order, you can kind of think of COE being our designer of record, having served us up our 100% issue for construction designs. But now we invited a new party to the dance, Pacific Pile Marine. Pacific Pile Marine's going to have some questions about COE's designs, or COE's going to have to do some oversight of Pacific Pile Marine. So that's what this is. Now we're all in the dance together. Okay.
The next category is repackaging for 2021 ITB that we're contemplating. $340,000. The predominance of that $340,000 is in hose tower design. And when we initiated our contract with COE, we envisioned the hose tower design to be what's called a performance specification, which they define the parameters that this hose tower has to perform at. And then when it goes out to bid, the construction contractor would work with a fabricator to develop a hose tower that meets all the criteria. Through the BE and cost reduction workshop process, really understanding what that hose tower is going to cost and how much we can reduce the cost of it, we found that we really need to advance the design so we can understand it better. So we're expending $219,000 now to advance the design. But one way to look at it is, if we don't do that, the construction contract bids that we get in for the 2020 work, the contractor will have to carry that cost, take that design to 100% to fabricate it. So we're just choosing to do that work up front rather than pushing it off on the construction contractor as an engineering piece of equipment.
And continuing my role in the peanut gallery, just to remind everyone what the hose tower is. So we have these massive tidal fluctuations down at the port. They're offloading fuel. The boat's moving up and down 27 feet or some such. So you have to have some extra hose length to accommodate the boat moving all around. But you can't pinch the hose in between the boat and the berth base. So somehow you got to manage the extra hose length. What we've done currently is have a hose tower where you literally lift up the hose so it gets out of the way. The current petroleum cement terminal design has a hose tower with an extra loading arm. In the value engineering discussions, there's been discussion about whether we can skinny that down. In order to make sense of that discussion, we thought now's the time, rather than saying whoever comes after Pacific Pile Marine to do 2021 work, say build us a hose tower and some specifications, they'll go design it. We'll design what we have now to 100%, and then we'll realize whether there are cost savings if we take the loader arm off or if we do some sort of reduction.
Yes, Ms. Salto.
Thank you. So we're going to spend $219,000 to determine if we can save additional dollars
Yes,
through
not
value
quite,
engineering.
not quite, and I hope that that's not lost. So right now, as Jeff was describing, we have a requirement for whoever actually finishes the petroleum cement terminal to design and construct a hose tower. This suggestion is to say, we'll go ahead and design it now. So we'll do all the design work and we'll get 100% issue for construction design work for the hose tower. The reason we want to do that ourselves rather than pass it off to the contractor, which is the original idea, is that we might be able to skinny it up a bit, and we don't really know what the realizable cost savings are until we know exactly what it costs and looks like.
So will the value engineering happen while we're getting toward 100% design? Or only after?
That's the next slide, right? Value engineering.
Well, it's sort of all
It's concurrent.
Concurrent?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So a couple more items. South Backland stabilization was designed and constructed under a progressive design build contract, and COE has to incorporate the as-built details into their drawing set to make sure that the two projects are coordinated, which was an anticipated expense.
So the petroleum cement terminal touches the land at the South Backlands, which we just stabilized. south backland stabilization is now actually finished, so there are as-built surveys of that didn't exist before it was finished, and now code needs to marry them up so they're all.
We're updating the impressed current cathodic protection system drawings to reflect the south loading dock. We've moved that from 2019 construction to 2020, and the way the cathodic protection system is powered, we're flipping the sequence, so we've got to go through the drawings and make sure that the power's supplied properly based on the current construction sequence. Reworking fender panel brackets is something that Pacific Pile and Marine brought to us as constructability idea. Right now, the drawing was to shop fabricate our piles with fender brackets at the top of the piles, and not knowing exactly how deep we would have to drive the piles, we have 7 layers of fender brackets so that one of them would hit the right elevation. Pacific Pile and we talked about that and decided that we could eliminate 6 of those brackets and field weld one bracket in 2021 with a proper location and save money. So we're going through and redoing the drawings to show the brackets as one bracket, not multiple brackets, and showing it as a field welded item instead of a shop welded item in the piling. So it's a result of a cost reduction conversation. And if the cost savings is on the order of, say, $200,000. Accommodating MOA development services comments, we get to go through the same building permit review process that most construction projects do. Our purview is limited to the building itself, but not the structure. And we've gotten a number of comments from building services to make some changes. And so we're picking up all those comments and incorporating them. And then the last thing is ABI has got a designer of record to design their infrastructure improvements on the new terminal. That's their contribution. One of their contributions to the project is they're responsible for relocating all of their infrastructure from its current location onto the new PCT. And part of that is that their designer has taken the COE design, gone through it and asked for some changes in layout at the shoreline to accommodate their equipment and whatnot. So we're spending $33,000 to coordinate the final designs between those 2 design teams. And this allows ABI to install all their infrastructure. Okay. The next one is repackaging for the south floating dock, and it's similar to the previous one where we're taking input from the CMAR, which this was under the CMAR contract in 2019 before we de-scoped it. Here's a number of RFIs for clarification and whatnot. Having COE go through and update that, their drawing set, update their drawing set with the south backland stabilization, construction as-built, updating the impressed current cathodic protection based on this revised sequence, and just going through and cleaning up the drawings and the documents so that when it goes out to bid, there's no ambiguity and we don't find ourselves in claim situations or things like that. So the previous slide was $350,000, which looks like a lot of money when you look at it from a perspective of an $80 million contract. That's a very small fraction to make sure that we get the bid documents correct and get right numbers and have fewer claims in the end. So as a percentage, I feel like this is appropriate.
Ms. Alto?
Thank you. So for 2020, so this lump sum set up, this one. So this seems like what we were repackaging for 2021, we're kind of doing a little bit lighter version for 2020 through a lump sum. Is that somewhat fair? I mean, I see some.
They're both lump sum.
Oh, they're both lump
Yes.
sum. Oh,
Because
I guess.
you quantified the actions that COE
Oh, you
needs to
quant.
take.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that there. So we have, but we're doing similar things both times.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
It's just about updating the drawings set with things that have changed, incorporating as-built information. So like I said, it's all in the vein of getting the best price when we go out to competitive bid, having the drawings clean and correct, and avoiding claims in the end.
Thank you.
This last category is the VE evaluations. We've asked for $200,000 in budget, which is all T&E expense. some of the ideas under consideration, one of them being a self-rescue ladders added to the PCT, which is a cost increase, ironically enough. But going through and doing some design evaluation to add rescue ladders, self-rescue ladders to the structure. There's talk of adding a gangway, which is about a $100,000 item. And then we are, with the working group, still working on redesign or relocate the operations building, evaluating the hose tower, and eliminating the second aromatic petroleum pipeline. So those are the things that we're still working on. But we've got price from COE on the level of effort for the first one is $16,000. And then the bigger issue is the monopile design.
Actually, me, okay, go back.
Sure, and then Ms. LaFrance does have a question.
Yeah, just to kind of unpack this and give you kind of a snapshot of where we are. We've been meeting regularly with the Value Engineering PCT subcommittee. And after many weeks, the first things to emerge were, why don't we add some costs? We could potentially add some ladders on the pile so if somebody falls overboard, they can scamper back up. Those were never included originally because we think they get torn off by ice, but we said that we would look at it. There was then a suggestion that right now, in order to get a person onto a vessel from the Peace Petroleum Terminal, you have to put them in the man bucket, or whatever we call it, person basket. We said, well, couldn't we have a gangway that was sort of hinged to the dock and goes up and down and slides back and forth? We said, well, we'd have to accommodate that structure somehow, some way, but sure, we look at that too. So cost reductions were two potential cost additions initially. As we have gone through the components of the petroleum cement terminal, the three that look like potential cost reductions are the operations building itself, which is that, recall the one that originally had this plug number, which was astronomically crazy high, millions of dollars for this 2-story small building. It's gotten smaller and smaller, but we're still looking at whether we can skinny it down to its sort of theoretical minimum. That's the bullet point number 3. With the hose tower, which we've already discussed, whether there's a way to make that simpler without sacrifice performance. And then this new one is just arrived, and we're sort of waiting to hear from the fuel users whether this one has legs. Right now, POL1 and POL2 have either 5 or 4 fuel lines coming off of them. Petroleum cement terminal, as designed, has 6. And the 6 lines, let's see if I can get this right, are methanol, low sulfur diesel fuel, aromatics, and
two distillates.
As it turns out, the aromatics, which you can think of as gasoline, right now we have the capacity of one of the 2 existing facilities to plug a single vessel into both of those aromatic gasoline type lines at the same time. And that happens, as I understand it, once a year from the NRC guys. So the suggestion at the last value engineering meeting was, maybe we don't need that. Maybe we can get rid of one of the aromatic lines, and that should be a real cost savings. The folks who were in the room last time said, we really do want a different line for low sulfur diesel fuel because you've got to keep that one separate. We really do want one for methanol. You do need both of the distillates because some of the vessels that come in are so heavy that if they can't unload with both of those fuels, they'll literally hit the bottom of the inlet before they finish unloading. So that's one that we're still chasing the ground, but maybe we take the second aromatic line off, and then that involves tell the designer record delete one of those lines.
Any question on that, Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, that is the information I was going to ask about. But on that topic, do you have a sense yet of the potential value engineering cost savings?
That is hard to ballpark. So the first 2 are additive in the amount that Jeff was describing. So let's see, I don't know what the rest of that cost, but probably not.
Probably between the gangway and the rescue ladder should probably $200,000 cost increase.
The operations building, I don't know, maybe you want to spitball all these the best
I
parts?
wouldn't spitball on the operations building, the hose tower. I would say eliminating the second aromatic petroleum line is probably $2 to $4 million savings.
That's the one that moves the needle. I think the hose tower and the ops building, as we've estimated them, are less than that. But if you deleted them entirely, you wouldn't save that. But we can get you something.
So best case scenario for a ballpark right now is offsetting and equaling the amount, the 200 that it's costing, and possibly a little bit more
Yeah, if we can
savings.
eliminate that second aromatic line, that's going to be a net reduction to the project.
Okay.
Well, that wouldn't be net zero. We think that if you eliminate that line, then that's a couple $1 billion.
Oh, a couple million.
But we also need to hear from the most effective users whether they know something that makes that no go. So
Got it, thanks.
And that one is, that is emerging in real time. That came up at our last value engineering meeting.
Ms. Alto?
Thank you. As we're talking about value engineering, I know there have been discussions about whether we'll need the other POL2, right? If I'm right, it's a
Yes.
PCT POL2. Are there talks about how this kind of plays into the overall project as well? To some extent, what you're considering here might be saving money down the road.
I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, part of our discussion with the aromatic pipeline and all the pipelines when we met last time was thinking through how we are, for some period of time, potentially going to have all three of these facilities available. And then in the longer time, at least one of the old facilities and this facility until we can get to whatever the sort of super long-term solution is. So yes, that was informing our thoughts about whether you would need this extra line. Because it will be some period of time where the two lines do exist at one of the current facilities. So for the one time a year that you might need it, maybe you send them there. But yes. Thank you.
All right, the last, the big VE evaluation that we're working on right now is the Dolphin design. One of them is Monopile, looking at that. The second one being a battered pile Dolphin solution that Ascent has brought up and it's been kicked around quite a bit. Between the gangway, the self-rescue ladders, and these two issues, we're looking at close to $100,000 of known evaluation expense. And this doesn't include implementation. If we say, yeah, let's go ahead and modify the design documents to incorporate this. So that's how we kind of came up with the $200,000 budget, was to try to keep it not going too far, but have enough budget that we didn't have to write another change order 3 months from now, come back to you and ask for a little bit more money. So that's how we quantified it. On the monopiles, the criteria that we're looking at is 2 reductions in the seismic criteria, just to see how much it moves the needle and really try to better understand the seismic premium cost. One of them is changing the design earthquake, which is the largest earthquake performance criteria, from controlled and repairable as defined by the GAC as repairable within 5 to 7 days, to going back to what the code requires for controlled and repairable is 3 to 5 months. So it's a slight reduction in the performance criteria of the highest level of earthquake, just to see how much that moves the needle on the cost.
I think there might be a question on that. Ms. Alto?
Thank you. Does that affect, or does our getting any of the federal dollars play into this conversation at all, or any of the outstanding grant applications for federal dollars? I know some of them had to do with things like resiliency and earthquake. So are we well within the scope of everything we've applied for as we consider these?
I know that some of the pre-disaster mitigation have been about sea level rise and about seismic resiliency. And I want to maybe answer a different question, which is say, I'm not sure any of these investigations are going to motivate any different behavior, but at least in the value engineering conversations, there's been this acute interest in what is the premium we are paying for having made this decision. And there's no way for us to tell anyone with certainty. We have good estimates, I think, ballpark estimates, of what the decision to go with the highest level of seismic criteria did. But until we delete those and sort of run a 35% design, we'll not be able to answer that to the satisfaction of the people who've been asking the question. So I think this is in the category of design to spend a little money to make us smarter, but I don't think it's going to motivate us to say, never mind, we don't want to do seismic resilience.
Okay,
What's
I guess I would want to know, just as we've looked at the federal funding opportunities, if we're still within what they're requiring, because we got fortunate and we got some federal funding,
Yeah.
and I believe there's still more we're waiting on.
We're applying for lots of
Yeah.
opportunities, but I'll defer to Sharon. If we would like.
Hi, for the record, Sharon Walsh, the Deputy Director at the Port. And the pre-disaster mitigation grants that we applied for earlier this year, there was a new program called Resilient Infrastructure Construction, and that was tied to the resiliency features, but we were not selected for that one, so that one's off the table. It's interesting for the build grant that we just received, I'm pretty excited about. If you go to their, we did mention that we were part of the reason it's for leveraging infrastructure investment and so on, is that we were bringing things to a more state-of-the-art situation, and we mentioned the hose tower, and actually in their little synopsis that they published nationwide, they made a point that we were going to use a state-of-the-art hose tower. So, but you know, in terms of the resiliency piece, no, that's not affected by the grants out there right now.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that this is in the evaluation stage because, as you know, there have been questions about the costs of this aspect of the design. Can you remind me, what is the design earthquake in purely layperson, non-engineering terms?
I would say that the best way to think of it is we've got an operation level earthquake, which is a reoccurrence interval of every 75 years. So it's a 6.5, maybe a 7 earthquake. I mean, they're rated in reoccurrence interval and ground acceleration. It's not really a Richter scale measurement that corresponds to something like that. The next level is a contingency level earthquake, which is a 475-year reoccurrence interval, and it's like the 64 earthquake. And then a design earthquake is the big one. It's a 1,000-year reoccurrence interval, and it's 10.0 or something like that.
But the design earthquake for
So
what?
So when the design is conducted, they check all three of those criteria. How much damage will be done at an operational level earthquake to the structure? They check the stresses in the rebar and things like that. Do the computer modeling. They look at how much damage and could it be repairable within 5 to 7 days. That's the minimal damage criteria. The second one is contingency level earthquake. It's a 475-year reoccurrence interval, and it is defined as, the performance is defined as controlled and repairable within 3 to 5 months, something like that, 3 months back in service. And then the design earthquake, which is the big one, it's a reoccurrence interval of 1,000 years, and it's essentially life safety, which means the structure essentially needs to be demolished and replaced, but nobody will die on it, it will collapse. So those are the three performance criteria that a structural design goes through, and the structure has to meet all three of those criteria.
And that's under
So
code.
the GAC recommended that at the design level earthquake, the performance criteria being minimal damage has to be repairable within 5 to 7 days. So that's stepped up or a lot. So we're looking at, if we back off one level of performance, which is controlled and repairable within 3 months, at that design level earthquake, how much does that move the needle in terms of?
Quick follow-up. So when I'm talking about this with constituents, is it accurate to say that it's been designed to withstand like a 1964 level earthquake and be repairable within 5 to 7 days?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the intent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's the first seismic criteria that we were asking COE to look at. Then the next level is just meeting the minimum ASE 6114 criteria, no extra on top of that. So we kind of have 3 data points of the GAC recommendation as put on the table, backing off the highest level from minimal damage to control and repairable level, design level earthquake, and then just meeting the code as it's written. So we'll be able to see kind of how much the needle moves as we adjust that criteria. Now, it's still to be discussed, and I know the memorandum from the Assembly was that we need to conform to the GAC's recommendation. So if there's a significant cost savings, we would go back to the GAC and say, let's talk about your recommendation, and try to have that conversation of whether they modified their recommendation and they're okay with the changes. But they're a party to this conversation. Another criteria is right now the top of the dolphins have a concrete cap, which is a lot of weight at the top of a very tall cylinder. Looking at changing that to steel to lighten up that load, which in a seismic event reduce stresses. So we're looking at steel versus concrete decks. During the design process, we ruled that out just from a corrosion perspective, but now we're going back and looking at it from a seismic perspective. How much does that help us? And then last is reducing the design vessel size. There's been some questions about what petroleum design vessel we use. Do we use a smaller design vessel? So those are the criteria we're going to go back and look at the monopile design and see how much each one of these individually and in aggregate moves the needle on the tonnage of steel, which is related to the cost. Secondly, the batter pile design. The batter pile design was was stopped at 35% in lieu of a monopile design, which showed up at 65% based on constructability input from the C-bar. We're going to take the 35% batter pile design, we're going to advance it to 65% using everything we know today, all the final criteria. So we're going to bring it up to date, do a cost estimate on it, and then compare that to the cost of a monopile to see if through design development and the process that in fact now as criteria has changed or been refined. Initially we thought that the batter pile design was more expensive than a monopile. So we're going to go back and look at this and go, well, is that still true today? Are batter piles still more expensive than monopiles?
So to totally review the bidding here, we'll call it the dolphins, the thing you tie the vessels to. There was a first order design choice. You take one gigantic cylinder and smash it into the ground. Monopile, you need a really big hammer to do that. That was the solution that was picked first because the install time was less, and second because of permitting risk. That it turns out that the sound you make in the water when you jam one monopile only goes so far. If instead you say, I'm going to take a bunch of smaller piles in this kind of tripod formation and take them into the ground in a batter pile formation, the initial take was it takes longer to install, you install them at angles, you have to build all these templates, it's more complicated, and when you drive them, it's louder, and so the beluga whale impacts are almost impossible to permit. That said, there has been conversation in the value engineering group that because you need a super giant hammer to install these monopiles, maybe you have artificially constrained the bidding environment. And if you could take a fresh look at batter piles and convince yourself that maybe they are cheaper or in the ballpark, that competitive pressures would make them a cheaper solution overall, that can help us somewhere down the road. Right now the tote facility has a batter pile to come. I still think the permitting risk probably takes this one off the table entirely, but it has been of acute interest by some members of the value engineering group that we said we would have taken up.
Ms. Alto?
Thank you. So it seems to me that you would want to just talk with whoever our permitting folks are to find out if it's even in the realm of possibility before spending $20,000 to determine and bring it up to design. Just a thought. But second, we're only talking about beyond the PCT here for this, or are we talking, because I thought we just awarded a contract that's going to use a monopile design. Or are we talking about shifting that at this late stage?
So the contract that we let does not have the monopiles in it. That's in the 2021 scope of work.
Fully answer your question. You are right. The first thing you might want to do is talk to the permitting. And the permitting people have looked at it and said, this dog is not likely to hunt. We are trying to be good neighbors here because this keeps coming up in the value engineering discussions. I think that even if it is cheaper, it may be impossible to permit, so I'm not exactly sure why we're chasing it all the way. But as good neighbors, I think we're trying to make an investment to answer that question definitively. Is it cheaper? It might not be. And if it's somehow radically cheaper, then we can then figure out if there's a permanent change. It shouldn't. I don't think there's any scenario in which it affects the petroleum cement terminal because we already have applied for our incidental harassment permit for this future 2021 scope of work with a monopile design. There was some suggestion from folks that we could keep going and then go back to the National Marine Fisheries Service and say we changed our mind. I think our permitting guys are like, but we, like I say, this is what we were asked to do. So we do.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to advance the design, do a cost estimate, see if the batter piles from our cost estimate are more expensive than we're done talking about. If they're close to being comparable, then the next step would be to do a risk analysis. And really the simplest way to look at the risk analysis is there's a lot more hydroacoustic and marine mammal risk in the batter pile design, and it takes 2 to 3 times more duration in the field to install for more numbers of piles. Versus the other side of the coin is, will we get multiple bids on this big giant monopiles? There's only a handful of contractors that have big enough equipment to install those, but there are a handful of contractors that have equipment big enough to install them. So that's really we have to evaluate that risk versus reward if they're reasonably comparable in cost.
May I ask a question? Thank you. Wasn't there discussion about talking about within the monopile design as well, reducing the size of the pile I don't see that in the list.
The batter piles are smaller, and they take ice forces differently. So.
No, not with regard to batter, just in a monopile design. I mean, I remember hearing that we could potentially reduce the size, and therefore reduce the need for the extra large hammer, just a large hammer, and then might open up to additional bidding.
So
based on the outcome of this analysis.
So this is step one to
Yes.
determine if that is, like,
This
that would
is
be
how-
another phase, okay.
We can go to smaller diameter or narrower wall thickness.
So first we need the seismic determinations, and then we can go to
How
that
does these
phase.
variables move the needle? If doing all these things takes us from a 12-foot diameter monopile down to a 10-foot diameter or something, then yeah, maybe that's great. If it takes us from 12 foot down to 11.5 feet, that probably didn't help us that much. So we just need to see how much we can move the needle with these different criteria.
Okay, thank you, that's more clear.
Thank you.
So there's one question that hasn't been asked.
Sure.
That I've heard from somewhere. So just assume that there are some cost savings that are discovered through the value engineering process. How do those savings materialize in the overall approach to the contract? Do we see a net reduction? Do we see some kind of a communication back to us that we are now X dollars lower, that just get folded into some other area of a contract? What's the process for us as policymakers to be watching for when we get to that?
That's a good question. I guess the answer is, on the path we're on now, we would have a bid package ready to go next spring. And at that moment, we would tell you, as a result of all of our double checking, measuring twice before we cut once, we have deleted the following things from the original idea. That has changed our internal cost estimate of what it would take to go from 81 million to pick a number smaller than 81 million. But then the real proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and when we open the bid documents, then we'll know what it actually costs. We won't really ever have a moment where somebody told us what 6 lines versus 5 lines were other than our own estimate. We would tell you what it was at the bid submittal period. That's right. I don't know if that answers your question. It was my best attempt to answer your question.
It's reasonable. It raises more questions, but I don't need to answer here.
Thank you.
So just to recap here, we've got a $1.1 million change order to the contract, $352,000 lump sum, that's the few credits that we talked about, and then this repackaging of 2021 work at the South Florida dock work. The P&E work, $200,000 is budget for pursuing these cost reduction ideas, and the balance is services during construction for the 2020 season.
Great. Mr. Prince?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to be absolutely clear, because some folks, when they saw this, assumed that the cost of the project at this point had increased. I understand that is not the case. This is, the change orders are, as Mr. Falsey said, built into the process so that the money isn't allocated all at once. And there have been some design changes, but for the most part, we are still proceeding with the assumption of being on budget.
Yeah, for the most part, and like I said, the T&E, $200,000 of that is cost reduction, investing in cost reductions, and I think at the end of the day, we'll get that money back. So that'll pay off in the end, but it wasn't in the current budget, so we'll have that system. The repackaging of the work to resequence, again, that specifically wasn't in the budget, but I think that at the end of the day, we're gonna get better bids, and there's no way to quantify that. And $219,000 of that $352 is in the hose tower, which that for sure we would see the contractors including that in their bid price, because they would have to do that engineering. So I think all told, yeah, this is on budget. We're forecasting another $600,000 roughly for change order number 5 for services during construction in 2021. And that's all in the program forecasted budgets. These are not new items.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Salato?
Thank you. I would say if we're going to get more change orders in the future, having this come along with it would be fantastic. This was very helpful. And similarly, if we're being asked to make decisions based on the change orders or some of the decisions made, breakdowns like this are really, really helpful because it's sometimes hard to keep track of where we're at in the entire port design process and which element we're talking about. So thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Constant?
Different topic.
Is it similar?
It's, yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Similar enough. So we have 2 items on the agenda that are utility issues or enterprise issues. And, when this came across the desk on the agenda, it was a surprise to the number of people that kind of substantial questions relating to the PCT weren't before the committee. And some of that's timing, I understand. And so just to members who are here, we have item 9D11, which is just a funding for the solid waste to energy facility conversation. And we also have an AWW fuel storage project. And then there's also the item that's 9F5, which is the adoption of the port terminal tariff. And 11I, which is the Cowie project that we have here, which we've just determined or discussed. And so the question that I had raised to me by members of the staff is, do we want to have a briefing on those items? The 2 items specifically, it's the $100,000 for the master plan of the solid waste energy, which we kind of had a pretty deep briefing on. And so I don't know that we need that. And then also the King Street project it's $1 million fuel storage project, $922,000. So the question is, generally, is there a sense that we should have a briefing on those?
So I guess one question for the administration on the WTE. So if we did have a briefing on it, would it be any substantively different from what we already got?
I think we do the chair. Mr. Khan. Only at the very margins. It's
Right.
the same story. This is the $90,000 to put our next foot forward. I think we're supposed to get a game plan out of that. What are the actionable next steps to make it real?
And then the tank one, same question.
And
I don't know if we've gotten a briefing on that.
You probably haven't got a briefing on the tank farm.
It's not tank
we'd be
farm.
happy to, or the fuel storage project.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to have a meeting that we all have.
But the meeting is Tuesday. That one's on the agenda for.
So is there any reason why we couldn't delay it 2 weeks?
I don't know as I sit here now. I also don't know that it's very exciting. But either way, I will ask if we can
Alternative
delay it.
C could Mark or someone just provide for us a brief summary that's a little bit beyond the AM.
Sure.
That can help folks have a context of what the topic is. Would that be reasonable? Then if people still have questions after that, it could be pulled.
Great.
And then the tariff conversation, I presume we'll be having a briefing on that after it's introduced.
We assume that you would probably want at least one work session.
Yes, very good. Okay, well, that answers the questions that were presented to me. Thank you. And just for good practice, big items on the board, send them to the committee if you can, save us work session time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.